What it do, everybody? It's your boy King Crowder, checking back in with another edition of history that you should know, or some valuable history that we're not taught enough about. Today's lesson will be breaking down the history and what is colonization. Colonization is a word that we hear thrown out a lot, but I think it's never been an actual deep dive into the subject and what actually happened. You must remember that we have a lot of globalization that happened with colonization in the world. What do I mean by that? So the word colony means farmer. Emperor, when you're improving on someone, means the command you're drawing attention to exercising one's power over one another. So the colonizers or the colonial powers at that time took over the indigenous or natural citizens to their country, and they forcibly put their laws, restrictions, and native things on them. With that being said, when colonialism first happened, you got to remember it's a political and economic domination over the indigenous people. When they were economically and politically dominated, everybody that lived in that land, naturalists, the indigenous people at that time, had their rights stripped from them. So what they began to do was, number one, they forced their religions, ideology, beliefs. It's a reason why we have so many Islamic and Christianity religions throughout the world. Evangelists went to these countries preaching their philosophy to these people, sometimes converting on their own, a lot of time forcibly converting these people to their type of religion and ideology. We must also remember that what the first thing they would do was they would take away the powers and maybe make all the men and kill all the men and keep the women and children. When they were separating them, you must understand that the ideology influence that we have politically was leaning towards them. So if I was never heard of or knew what the word democracy meant, you implementing that into my society when it's never been there can cause an issue. The issue would make you change everything you grew up doing and the type of environment that was going on at the time. You must also understand that this population that they were going into and colonizing them never had their rights and their humanity still with them. They took away all of that in the process of colonizing them. Colonization happened a lot physically, but mentally is where it had the biggest impact, and you can still see it, the biggest impact in the future and still going on to this day. The impact of colonization happened between major global powers, the Spaniards, the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Portugal. I want to start off by going over Asian region first. A lot of Asia was colonized early on by the British, especially in the southeastern regions. There were a lot of British and Spaniards and France colonizing those regions. One thing that I really caught interest to me was how India was colonized early on, and they uptook the official language, ideology, and belief systems of it. Many people in the Indian society still speak the King's English to this day and hold that in high regard, because when the colonial powers entered India, they transformed the beliefs and everything they could towards reforming that society. Next, let's focus on the African continent. When Africa was being colonized as well, you saw a lot of things being taken, stripped, and you also saw the resources of leniency towards the colonial powers. So a lot of the people that were in the African continent at one time could have had established religion and different things going on. But when you began to see the colonization began to happen, you began to see their religions, their native tongues, their ideologies, and their warriors being stripped. When these things were starting to happen early on, you got to understand, most of the colonizers were seeking resources. Resources being gold, being means to make their country wealthy, salt, spices, herbs, many different things went into why the colonial powers wanted to enter these regions. They were seeking something because where they were in their native country did not have them. So they had to go out and find, take, and pull back those resources to them so they could use them as their own native country. Another thing that I really found out interesting while diving into this research, you began to see the colonial powers leaving the European, Asian, and African regions. And after 1492, And when the Spain Moors fell, you began to see the other people from the Spain moving over to the Americas. One thing that most people got to remember is when Columbus went to the Americas, he never founded the New World. You cannot find where people are already living and native to. He simply went over to find resources for the kings and queens in Spain. So when Columbus came here, he never settled on what's known as the United States or Canada. He actually settled in the Caribbean. And when he landed into the Caribbean, that began the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade passage. One thing that we got to clear up that's very things that we don't know is that most African slaves of African heritage, only 3% of them came to the known as the North American United States. Majority of those 97% of the formerly enslaved Africans actually came to the Caribbean and to South America. It's a grave misconception that the American groups were infiltrated with a lot of African enslavement when it's not actually true. If only 3% of the population came from there was already a lot of indigenous people that we should be calling them Black American at this time were already here at this time, and they were already on this land. Now, doing like the colonial powers were doing, they were still seeking refuge, seeking a place to go, seeking new opportunity. They began to go towards the North Americas, and that's how we see our history of the United States of America being founded with the 13 colonies and the American Revolution and different things like that. We'll dive into in later videos. But breaking down why these things happen is so important and so impactful. Colonization really began to pick up steam around 1493 when the islands in the Caribbean of Hispaniola, post Christopher Columbus, first making his impact. Then you began to see Puerto Rico being colonized in 1508, Jamaica being colonized in 1509, Cuba being colonized in 1511, and Trinidad starting to see colonization in 1530. What you must remember is that around these times, a lot of sicknesses came from the European. The number one weakened their men. It was always a patriarchal society back in those times where the men led the households and fought the wars. So a lot of the strength going towards the battle, these new people from these European foreign lands, is that we must understand diseases was prevalent to them. So a lot of the warrior class died immediately because they were not used to the diseases that was given to them. So you have half the warrior class population dying out, not being able to survive. So when the colonial powers came in, all they had to do was seek the minds of the women and children. And when they got the minds of the women and children, psychologically, they made that whole superiority thing come down. Oh, well, these people must know more. Politically, they must know better. Economically, they know how to treat us. That's when you began to see the indigenous people confidence and changes come within their society. Not only they had the changes with them psychologically, they also forced them to pay more taxes. They forced them to live in certain locations. And that's when you start to see the segregation and when you isolate them and putting them in different locations. Colonization is such an important thing that is not taught that we should continue to emphasize because it happened so frequently inside of history. I have no bad taste in or energy towards how these practices happen, but we must understand and break down when they happen, how they happen, and what impact do we still see till this day. A lot of the systems that we know about is a form of how the racist society is prevalent in the United States. Racism is so prevalent because the colonial powers came this way and implemented something on the indigenous population. That's why you see when you go to certain communities that the segregation in certain neighborhoods is still so prevalent. When the colonization powers came here, they came to implement their rule of law, their location, their native tongue, their ideology, and forced it on the people. As time flew by and emerging classes and marriages and things happened, we began to see those effects of the colonization happening over time. The reason why this is so impactful, again, is that the history of colonization breaks down how these things happen. Remember, gold, power, and resources are the top three things that they always want to go after. God, glory, and gold. God, glory, and gold. I want to chime into this lesson because I believe it is definitely underserved. It is definitely undertaught, and we do not discuss as most as we should the history of colonization. It's your boy King Crowder checking back out again, y'all. Came to you with a little bit longer lesson than I normally do, but I think this period is something that I'll even break down in details more on, but it is something that we must focus on and we must dive into details on over time. Checking out. Peace.